Brace yourself.
Upon its announcement, I originally interpreted Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair as a concession, as Playtonic admitting that revitalizing the 3D Collectathon platformer was something beyond their grasp. The original Yooka-Laylee had so many underlying issues, so I was hoping that Playtonic would be able to take a long, hard look at the genre they helped create and see what Yooka-Laylee was lacking to fulfill that complete state. Yooka-Laylee's quality was not an indication of the genre's inherent flaws. The Collectathon on its own was not something dead by design. There was success to be found. But Playtonic didn't take that route. Instead of a full-on 3D platformer sequel, what was announced was a 2D side-scroller set in the same Yooka-Laylee universe. Like I said, this felt like Playtonic admitting defeat, and to this day, I don't totally absolve that mindset. Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair takes the gameplay to a more, I guess I'll say, straightforward direction. In a time when the company needed to recapture much of the fan faith not just in the studio, but the genre as well, a 2D platformer didn't seem like the way to do it. But I have this strange personal stake in this series. I never backed the Kickstarter for the original Yooka-Laylee, but I did track its development as far back as 2012, before it was even named Yooka-Laylee. Even with my disappointment in the first game's final release, I remained curious, especially with Playtonic shedding off a third dimension in this quote-unquote spin-off game. I guess you could say that I'm trying to validate my interest in this series with these videos, but regardless of whether that's true or not, I found myself picking up the game on Steam without much hesitation. Despite past grievances, there's a legacy that I'm just so compelled to investigate here. It's time to see if Playtonic's newest effort is the redemption they need. It's time to explore Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair. The Collectathon platformer blossomed in the 3D age, where games like Banjo-Kazooie could evolve exploration in a three-dimensional space, with movement mechanics and environmental puzzles to keep players invested and captivated, but it's not hard to see that the genre's influences weren't limited to 3D. It was clear that Rare had already planted the seeds for collecting trinkets in their games, as Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3 began to broaden their focus on collecting. DKC 2 definitely encouraged exploration while still preserving platforming as the game's core. But DKC 3 is where scouring the level for unique items to find began to take root as a major gameplay incentive. Knowing where the Collectathon identity truly began is kind of a deep dive, so I don't want to go too far into that conversation. But it's clear that, as the industry's move to 3 dimensions approached, gathering items was starting to become a pretty appealing gameplay prospect. Even as 3D Collectathons faded into obscurity, that didn't stop the Donkey Kong Country series from staying its course. The series preserved this mentality when it was passed to Retro Studios' hands, as Donkey Kong Country Returns and Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze opened the door to expansive level geometry and new hidden items to find and collect. Retro Studios didn't reject the explorative intrigue that made finding secrets so tantalizing and fulfilling. The puzzle pieces were fantastic spins on the formula, keeping that value that you saw in DKC 2 and 3's DK coins by encouraging player diligence, curiosity, and skill. Levels grew in scope and scale under new hardware, but there was still a lot to discover. Behind the over-the-top spectacle, Retro Studios followed Rare's lead in the growing Collectathon identity that the DKC series was cultivating. So, in 2019, with 2D platformers still holding popularity, especially in the indie scene, here comes Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair, a rejection of the 3D elements of its predecessor. It's probably the most shameless throwback that I've seen in ages. When it comes right down to it, this game wants to be Donkey Kong Country. From the moveset to the level design to the incentive structure, there are so many trappings to the DKC series that I can't help but be shocked. Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair is a 100% nostalgia trip. But really, this isn't new for Playtonic in the slightest. Nostalgia is their bread and butter. Hell, in my original Yooka-Laylee video, I attempted to show how the 3D Collectathon platformer sensibilities were implemented in that game, and most of the time, it didn't do a good job of preserving them. There was plenty of misrepresentation and miscommunication of the 3D Collectathon genre's appeal, and it resulted in a less than stellar experience. The Impossible Lair manages to do the same, implementing the mechanical direction of a past series, in this case Donkey Kong Country, to tap into that nostalgia, but this time around, things turn out much, much differently. The first Yooka-Laylee was designed to revitalize the 3D Collectathon, so whether you agree with it or not, it's not a rare perspective to hear that Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair is a bit of a step backward. However, I do want to sidestep that discussion and judge the game as it is, a 2D side-scrolling platformer. And there isn't too much else to it. The goal of each stage is to reach the battalion member imprisoned at the end while grabbing collectibles and searching for secrets. From right there, the Donkey Kong Country trappings are on full display, finding hidden goodies, collecting currency items, and wandering an overworld to open more levels. It all harkens back to that curious time of Donkey Kong Country 3 where Rare was experimenting with integrating collectible hunting within a 2D side-scroller. It expands the ideas of DKC3's hub, encouraging more exploration and rewarding players for being observant and diligent, providing plenty of secrets, shortcuts, and general incentives. The overworld is a very healthy inclusion, as I spent a considerable amount of time scouring for new items and collectibles that were buried outside of the levels themselves, totally engrossed with what I could find beneath the surface. The isometric view was reminiscent of 2D Zelda games of all things, and I really couldn't help but appreciate how this overworld took cues from titles outside of Rare's famed side-scroller trilogy to build its world and structure its design. But while Donkey Kong Country 3 is clearly an influence, platforming doesn't feel as neglected here as it was in that game. Enemy placement and hazard arrangement are a strong focus, taking cues from the first two games in the DKC series instead. More arbitrary limitations like auto-scrolling and timers aren't as prevalent at all, as Playtonic spent a considerable amount of effort simply making a challenging but still fair collection of platforming levels, each with a leisurely but still propulsive pace. While the actual geometry can be a bit simplistic and stages lack the dynamic spectacle of a game like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, this is still a solid bunch of stages that stay true to a simple, straight-ahead design direction. The split difference between collected, introspective pacing with challenging platformer setups is impressive. When it comes to how each level is arranged, there aren't many to scoff over at all. Each level in Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair has two forms. The first can be accessed simply by finding the level entrance book on the overworld. The second, however, requires some kind of action that changes the entrance book itself. For example, you might need to reroute water to flood atop a book's location. What's really impressive about this isn't simply that you get two versions of a single level, but that what you do in the overworld changes the properties of the level thematically. If you flood the book's location in the overworld, the level itself becomes a flooded version of the original level. The game gets extremely creative with how this is done, as features like sticky honey, an army of enemies, or even turning the level on its side are all initiated in the overworld. It's a brilliant way to keep aesthetics and even stage design from feeling too familiar, and it's pretty tough to predict how a level is going to change, even when you start examining the overworld more deeply. However, when it comes to theming, Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair isn't as focused. Individual levels rarely have a singular identity to build around, which can cause some levels to appear similar to one another. There are many industrial levels, which isn't necessarily a problem on its own, but once so many level gimmicks are reused, you start to see Playtonic stretching themselves a bit too thin. Color palettes are a noticeable irk, because while the game has stunning graphics on a technical level, the level color direction can feel busy, cluttered, and unfocused. This was a sore spot from the game's initial announcement, but the main issue is this: these levels lack tone. In comparison, Donkey Kong Country nailed this to a T. Each level had a unique stylistic tone, allowing them to thrive on distinctive elements and make each stage memorable on its own. Better yet, the levels were not just able to add new gimmicks to keep things feeling fresh, but also managed to repurpose and recontextualize them for new gameplay twists. In Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair, even with the alternate versions of each chapter, there aren't many singular standout gimmicks for the player to learn about and internalize. Buzzsaws, conveyor belts, wooden and metal crates, these are not uncommon assets. Even worse, they're not often repurposed in any kind of unique way, which plays to level's detriment more often than not. Like I said earlier, the dual level concept has its moments of genuine creativity, especially in the second stages of chapters like Wild Web Woods, Saw Blade Evade, and Buzzsaw Falls. But I wish the game did a bit more with these changes on a gameplay and even an aesthetic level. But despite these lulls, Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair still retains the kinetic and fluid movement of its influences. The controls are tighter than you can imagine, offering the player a continuous sense of command and direction to each move they make. This is a game that's going to grab the attention of the speedrun community like no one's business, simply in how truly well implemented the controls feel. The extent of the roll ability, the gliding momentum of the mid-air spin, it all comes together for a buttery smooth experience that encourages player practice and eventual mastery. I'd even go so far as to say this is a strong translation of the original Yooka-Laylee's movement mechanics, because despite the deficiencies in level and objective design, getting around the world still felt fluid. The 2D transition hasn't hindered the smooth, momentum-driven energy of Yooka and Laylee's moveset. It all comes together so well, and you're gonna need it, especially once you get to the game's titular final stage. The Impossible Lair itself is a pretty interesting concept on its own. It's a super difficult platforming gauntlet that the player is introduced to from square one, a stage that can be selected at the player's own discretion. It's a real challenge, but one that feels surprisingly fair for what it's trying to do. This isn't some Kaizo level with intentionally cheap hazards, but one carefully crafted to test your platforming muster. I'm genuinely impressed with just how fiendish this level can get, and while I find some of its aesthetic and mechanical components to seem a bit repetitive when taken as an entire level, I can definitely see why Playtonic are so proud of its difficulty. It's a real test. The Impossible Lair isn't just meant to be challenged when you have more battalion soldiers to use as extra hit points. It's also meant to be challenged after you've mastered the different skills and abilities that Yooka and Laylee use to explore the various levels. Understanding hitboxes, the pace of your roll ability, how the different hazards work in context with other environmental objects, these are all learned throughout the course of the game's main stages. Even post-tutorial, throwing the player into each of these platforming situations without them having any real knowledge of how the situations work was a pretty cunning move from Playtonic. It's assuredly possible for the player to take on the entire Impossible Lair without any knowledge of the hazard's functions, or even Yooka and Laylee's basic abilities, but it's not what Playtonic wanted the player to do. Playtonic wanted the rest of the game's levels to be the lessons, a macro teaching experience that informs and familiarizes the player organically. But I will say that because of the reliance on the older levels as the learning experiences, the Impossible Lair, as a result, doesn't do a very good job as a micro-teaching experience. It's built with the assumption that the player already knows how each level function works, and how Yooka and Laylee's moveset works. It acts as a tease more than anything, a motivator to get the player inching further to the grand finale. Surprisingly, the battalion members are pretty extraneous in the grand scheme of things. They're not teaching tools, but merely extra chances that can give you an additional hit point. Trust me, losing a battalion soldier early on, no pun intended, really stings, and can demoralize you to the point of ruining your run. Still, I do think the battalion soldiers were necessary factors, because without so many hit points, the Impossible Lair really does feel challenging to the point of excess. It's a long level, one that tests endurance as much, if not more, than pure unfettered skill. Someone will need an extra chance or 12 at some point. Capital B's boss fight sequences are also good ways to provide some relief from the nightmarish platforming, offering some opportunity for the main baddie to revel in his villainous intent, while also giving the player a nice collective of single-screen challenges to overcome. Overall, I can see what Playtonic were going for with the Impossible Lair, and if taken as what it truly was meant to be, a tough-as-nails final level that also acts as a carrot on a string for players, I can ignore its deficiencies. Yooka and Laylee really did come back from the brink with the Impossible Lair. While I hesitate to call it a true redemption, it's not a terrible game. Far from it, in fact. It's a wild ride that manages to do the past justice, delivering a charming world rich with creative exploratory design. Sure, it doesn't do anything crazy original, but it's a prime example of nostalgia done right. It's Playtonic playing to the 2D side-scroller genre's strengths, while adding a dastardly spin on final level. The Impossible Lair is such a tease, a comically evil final level that puts the player in their place from square one, but also gives them something to chase after throughout the course of the game's runtime. As I said, it's not a truly original idea, but Playtonic make it work so well within the context of Yooka and Laylee's adventure. The expansive overworld and plethora of secrets are natural fits for this kind of game, channeling the best parts of the Donkey Kong Country series. If you're going to go right for the nostalgia nerves, that's one of the top shelf series to pick. Playtonic's future is still uncertain, and I'm sure that Tooka-Laylee is still on the minds of many. But Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair is a step in the right direction, wherever that direction might lead. Is the future of Yooka-Laylee still in only 2 dimensions? I'm really not sure. But in the meantime, I think there's still a lot of joy in climbing to the top, even if you get knocked down a few dozen times.